And you're tuned in and you're watching this, if you're Irish or you're Scottish or Welsh, it doesn't matter. This is a colonial kind of a issue we're having in Ireland. The name of this is in the name of solidarity, but it's also outside the colony, I call it. And that's just a way of thinking. It's not literally physically outside a colony. It's just a way of thinking outside of conventional thinking. My name is Bernard Sweeney. I'm an Irish traveller, and I'm based here in Sligo in the northwest of Ireland, joined with a legend, Mr. Aldofph Reed Jr. So this is Wikipedia. If anyone wants to know what Wikipedia is, it's the poor man's university. Because when you're segregated from the institutions, it's not a bad place to go.
Right.
Aldofph Reed Jr. is an American professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in studies of issues of racism and U.S. politics. He has taught at Yale, Northwestern, and the New School for Social Research, and has written on racial and economical equality. Mr. Reed, would you like to add to that?
I'm good. Thanks a lot, Bernard. I appreciate it.
Okay, and we're also my good friend Dylan Foley, who's
wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, I will add one thing. It's a shameless plug, but my newest book is called The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, and it was just out in January. It's published by Verso, so it's available in Ireland and the UK.
Absolutely. So Dylan Foley is an archaeologist, historian, and yeah, let Dylan give his spiel and tell us what he's up to.
I was officially an archaeologist. I studied archaeology and, computers and that way back in 2000 or so, a while ago now. I was a field archaeologist, so I wasn't so I used to follow the machines around Ireland, that kind of thing. Bernard would know that I come from the same town, where me and Bernard from the same place, so certain, how would you put it, the archaeology in Ireland was very much kind of created under, as what Bernard would say, came out of kind of the when Ireland was still under the empire, if you know what I mean, and it still has a lot of those kind of things in the background, that kind of philosophy going on in the background, like as if the Gaelic world is dead and gone, and we study it like ancient Rome or something, and it's unimaginable that there could be anything in the present that would be anything, any consequences in the present. So over the years, me and Bernard kind of tried to fit some of the history to put things into a bit of context, because as he describes when we got independence in Ireland, but we kind of the state tried to constructing a new Irish identity that was all modern, and yet at the same time it meant that they threw a lot of this stuff away that they perceived as being old-fashioned. And one of the big problems was that travellers became victims of that. We call them travellers, as Bernard explains. It's a bit of a euphemism, really. It was the kind of like the people, the last people still living in the way that Irish had originally lived. That was really the problem. But that, of course, the country perceived it as being backward, and we were going to be modern, and so all of these things had to be swept under the carpet. So, but we find that in Ireland, to try and deal with these problems, it's funny because some people say to me, well, archaeology, why would archaeology be involved? But in Ireland, we have to go back quite a bit. We have to go back 400 or 500 years to get to the beginning of some of these institutions and laws. So that's where I probably come in.
One of my first frightening moments of realizing there was something not quite right here, one of my first day at school, because I'd seen children in uniform. We didn't have uniforms, or even the uniform was kind of strange.
Right.
So it was a couple of years afterwards, the Village of the Damned. That popped up. And it stuck with me. It was like an anchor memory. It never left. Throughout my life, I was constantly suspicious of the education. Not that they were giving us an education anyway.
Right.
The closest you got into the classroom was usually the back of the class, and you'd be told you don't need an education because you'll either collect scrap or keep hoarding or something like that. That's why I say outside the colony, and because I come from a cultural mentality also of clan-based thinking and so on and so forth. And it isn't a cry for romanticizing history or to go back in time. We're fully aware we're here now in the now, but we also realize that the people who call themselves the default Irish are operating in a colonial mentality. And this is why we have this huge conflict, is like, who are the travelers, where they came from? Now, if you look at any of the history books, you'll see all our surnames, you'll see all the traditions, you'll see the battles, the wars, the arranged fights, arranged weddings. All of this is in the history book. It's in our community. We've got the same names, and yet these people will refuse to recognize that.
Hmm.
You might say the Gaelic culture is dead. Now,
Hmm.
I'll jump off there for a moment because it was something that I actually never really took any interest in it, the American politics in general, but more so, and I've been watching it, and it was the midterms. I had never heard of the midterms till this time around.
Yep.
Because now there seemed to be such a significance attached to it. And it's almost like the fate of the world hanged in the balance.
Right. Right.
I don't want to make it sound like that, but it is in many ways because we are pretty much in the Western belt and the Western world. So I'm going to ask you, did you get a result in the midterms? Would you say you're pleased with the outcome?
I'm relieved more than pleased. I mean, because for me, I mean, I think, and I wrote an article about this that you may have seen, that about the proximity of the danger of a fascist takeover in America, right? It's a real possibility. And many of the Republican candidates who are running, like a lot of these people are like a combination of psychopaths and hustlers and agents for rich reactionaries, basically. But if they won, then they would impeach Biden. They would. They couldn't do any more damage on the Supreme Court. They've taken control of that now. But they would undo, like their objective is ultimately to undo every bit of protective legislation and policy that working people have won over the last 100 years. And they're pretty clear about that. And they use, and like this is the way that race and categories like race have always functioned as a, I've described it recently as the equivalent of a pickpocket's dodge, right? You know how a pickpocket will kind of bump into you up here to get the misdirection so his hand can go behind your wallet. And this is what fascism hinges on. It hinges on stigmatizing others, made up others, ultimately, immigrants, right? People of different so-called races, and Lord knows there's no such thing as race, and we can talk about that too. And it's been successful enough in the U.S. since Trump, ultimately because the Democrats who present themselves as the protectors of the interests of working people have been on the side of the corporations for the last half century. Some of my friends in the labor movement, I would sit around drinking over the years and kind of joke about what's the best way to describe the relationship between the Democrats and the labor movement. And we thought things like, abused child or battered spouse. But what finally, and I don't know if this is a reference that will translate, but what we finally came upon was 2 a.m. booty call, right? Because the Democrats see us or see labor and working people as somebody they can call on the down low when the corporations aren't paying attention, and come by and gratify themselves, and then mainly by taking money and votes, and then going back to the corporations and giving them everything that they want and dangle a little promise between us or before us. So what I'd hoped could come out of the midterms was some breathing room, right? So that if our side would finally begin to organize and go straight to the working class base with concrete agendas that speak to people's needs and concerns, like national health care, for one, for instance. Over the 2 years between now and the next presidential election, we might be able to build enough of a force to be able to challenge what we know is going to be another fascist onslaught coming at us. I don't know that we have. I know that the outcome is less catastrophic than it could have been. I'm afraid that the Democrats aren't going to learn anything, that the lesson they're going to take from this was that, like all the bullshit they've been doing before was adequate and they don't need to change anything. And some of them are already talking that way. So, we'll see. But the bottom line is that, as working people, and it's true in Ireland just as it is here. I've been paying fairly close attention to Irish politics since the Great Recession, and have been kind of stunned at how Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and the Greens and even, God forbid, Labour are all on the sides of the banks and are all, able to get away with telling people shit like it's time to wear the green jersey, so we need to sacrifice for the fucking banks. And while at the same time, and I don't know if I'm stepping on toes here either, but where it seems to me that Sinn Féin is the only political force in the country that gives half a damn about working people, about the mass of working Irish people. And again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what the ruling class parties are able to do is point to a damn bombing, right, like in the North or in London, and say, look, they're all butchers and murderers and so forth and so on. And too many people pay attention to it. So well, we've got the same problems, and we need to try to figure out a way to break through. But in both these cases, like in all cases, I don't think there's any alternative to connecting directly with the great bulk of the working population, which obviously also includes travelers, to determine what people's actual concerns and needs are and to fight for them openly and unambiguously. And if we don't do that here, we're not going to have a chance. So.
Yeah. Just you're talking about, say, the class system, working class, middle class, and again, this is just outside the colony mentality kind of vision. We didn't come from the class system. We didn't come from the working class. We didn't come from the middle class. We didn't come from the elites.
Right.
So I can sort of visualize. I imagine you have this a lot of the time yourself. You can take a step back because your experiences give you that ability to start with. And sometimes you see O'Sullivan and O'Grady running around doing your head in because they're talking shite. But yet they use the Irish ancestry label to get your victim mode across. Well, I would say, and I know this is crossing over to Dylan's, but I was always interested in that because I would say in Ireland, colonial or working class is also a colonial label. It was born out of English colonization. And I think it sprung off from the Surrender and Read Grant in Ireland many centuries ago, where the Gaelic orders would give up their culture, give up their tradition, give up their language, and adapt an English law, English and swear allegiance to the English. That was around 1530. So come 1620, there was a guy who does maps. I think his name was John Mitchell and Seed. And he had drawn this map of Ireland. And then he had like 3 categories. And at the very top category was the gentleman and the gentlewoman Irish. The next one was the civil Irish, man and woman. And then the bottom one was the wild Irish. So coming from the community we came from, if I was to fast forward that to the present day, I would see that the same as the elites, the middle class, and the working class.
Right.
And
I think that's right. Yeah.
And I'd say, and just Sinn Féin, there is a sense of that, and we have it ourselves, because I think they came from a kind of a more working class background, that they have that ability to connect with rural Ireland. And
or I was just going to interrupt you, will I?
Yeah, do please.
I would say what you're saying is interesting. It's the when you look at Ireland, though, it's very much our politics is it's kind of based in the country never really industrialized, only small parts. I think that's partly what you're talking about there as well, Bernard. A lot of the Irish population never really involved in, it wasn't urbanized, wasn't industrialized, and a lot of it was still based on what we would call indigenous culture, and more similar to indigenous American culture, even things like that. They were watching the English culture come into the country and build cities and build that kind of industrial and capitalist world. And of course, a lot of Irish resistance to that over the centuries was not just a national resistance, but a resistance overtly actually to the kind of monetary system and the state system, that kind of thing. And you'd be right that actually, when you look at it, that thing you're saying about Sinn Féin, it's actually very interesting. The way I would see it, and some historians, is that the Irish dividing line is from the colonial history. The parties that we're talking about, or that we would call settled people, or the settlers essentially, the kind of culture of the cities of Dublin that was English originally. In all the centuries, Ireland's the native population or that mentality has never really had control of the country. And if you look at we had an attempted revolution in 1916, which was a mix between native resistance, but also was really a socialist revolution, an attempted socialist revolution.
Right.
Then we have a counter revolution in 1922, and really, for the last 100 years, the country is trying to deal with that counter-revolution. And that's exactly what you described. Those parties, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, all them, were very much represent kind of like what's respectable in Ireland is actually the colonizer culture. And what Sinn Féin and represent, and including working class and left, is kind of lumped with that. They're put in with being savages.
Okay.
You see? Because it really comes from that whole.
Well, that makes sense to me now that you describe it. Yeah, it really does. Yeah.
And that's the dividing line. And hence, when it's not even left and right in the psychology, they mightn't be conscious of it, but when they're talking about Sinn Féin getting power, they'll react as if it's like the Indians getting a hold of the ship.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not the same. Like, it's not just ideological. This is like a real visceral fear that the colonists will be, and people aren't aware of it anymore. We all act. Irish or
quite an interesting statement by one of the politicians, I think it was Fine Gael, a while back, about if Sinn Féin gets in, they have no loyalty to the state, and then we've referenced them as the Sinn Féin tribe.
Okay.
On another occasion, the leader said, "If I'd rather see the wolves back in Ireland than Sinn Féin in government," which the wolves were also associated with the wild Irish. He would say the Irish were living with the wolves.
Okay.
Of course, it wasn't. It was the other way around. The wolves were living with us.
We have that difficulty, as Mr. Reed was pointing out there. We have that difficulty that they can just point. They can undermine any even like coherent socialist arguments and things like that. By just pointing, like as you said about the bombs and all that has a long history going way back, and they just say, "We see they're savages. They're terrorists. They're not."
Right.
We could go back centuries, and we would see the same kind of rhetoric.
Wow. Yeah. This is fascinating. It makes perfect sense. But I wonder, pardon me, if you think there's some way to overcome or like to undermine, that over time.
Yeah. Well, that's what part of that partly that story is what Bernard's described. The travelers, they quashed traveler history. Do you remember, Bernard? You were mentioning the 1963 report and all that. The fundamental thing was that they quashed by actually erasing traveler history. They actually said, "Oh, the travelers don't have a history," and even though as Irish clans they have 1,000 years of history, right?
Right.
But they were successful during the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, in kind of erasing the consciousness of any history amongst the travelers and amongst what we call the settled Irish, mixed Irish that I come from as well, and it's so exactly the project that Bernard and myself working on is exactly that. We think that by reconnecting traveler and history, it kind of brings things into focus. How do I put it? Allows us to get back behind that counter-revolution, back to the back to the original aims of the.
There was a build-up, say, I think around 1910. You would have so later, like people like James Contley, Douglas Hyde. You had all these people, and they went into the west of Ireland from Dublin. So Dublin had paid them to go in and create a Gaelic image. So all of these people went into Achill Island, Inishmore, and the Tinker culture. So they brought back their paintings, their playwrights, their poems, their songs. In actual fact, De Valera's wife, Sinead, had played the part of the fairy to Douglas Hyde's Tinker. So they knew who we were. So all of them, they created this image and brought to Dublin. Now, if you think about it, why would Dublin be going into the west of Ireland for a Gaelic image unless they were not Irish? They were operating in an old English way of thinking. So they needed a green cover to pull over themselves. Declare themselves as the new Irish. So come 1922, there was a lot of suppression. It wasn't just travellers. And we don't separate ourselves from the rest of the population. We're consciously aware that whatever human being is genetically related. We get it. So all we could ever be talking about is mentalities and cultures and worldviews. So come 1922, we were probably some of the first to get suppressed. But that wasn't just us. It was the arts also. They squashed the arts because if you think about it, the 1916 was built upon arts. William Yeats and all these poets. So they created that kind of revolution. Then come 1937. And even at that point, Dublin had their own legal system. in 1936, after the Free State, they were still operating on a different legal system than the rest of Ireland. But it was only,
really?
Yeah, it was only in 1937 when they done the Constitution that they had to kind of broaden it out. It all became Irish Constitution. But in there, poor Sinead de Valera's wife no longer could be an actress because in the Constitution they had resigned women to the home.
Of course, yeah.
So and women played a pivotal role in the 1916 uprising. So anyone that represented the old revolutionary makeup, the tinker culture, the Gaelic culture, women, James Connolly. Now, you think about James Connolly, and this I know little about anything, but I always sense that the guy, he died because he was trying to apply Gaelic principles. And a lot of people have missed that part. So they come say that James Connolly stood for socialism and all the things that he did stand for, but he actually died trying to get the Gaelic principles across the line.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I would say that, we'll let you speak there. I was only going to say that Mr. Connolly, Connolly was the main driver. So we had a socialist revolution in 1916, as I'm sure you're aware.
Right. Yep.
James Connolly had been heavily influenced by working in America in the IWW.
Right.
And of course,
in fact, I saw I saw the wall where Connolly was executed.
Right. Yeah, in Dublin. Yeah. His genius at the time that I would see was that, and this is what we lost, and this is what you were asking a minute ago when you're saying, can we see a way out of it? But we're trying to reconnect that history because we were trying to recover a little bit of why had the states so suppressed travelers, for example? Why had they segregated them? Why had they took away the history? All that kind of stuff. And as Burns alluding to, the idea was to make themselves legitimate identity of Irish. The travelers had to have no identity.
Right. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
And in 1916, I mean, one of the things that James Connolly had been one of his bits of genius that I had seen was that he had managed to link the settlers' identity, the working class people, the industrial, and everyone who was marginalized in that way to the original native Irish struggle for which was also anti-colonial, but had not been socialist overtly, you know what I mean? Because but he managed to link the two by saying, well, they're the same struggle.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is another reason he had to die.
When we think about, say, the laws even today, like they take the travel organizations, they're operating on two departments, and that's the Department of Criminal Justice and so on and so forth. And the other department is the Department of Health. Now, in them 50 years, health statistics and issues that we never had before, we have them now. And this is with good people, with good intentions, with investment and funding. Overrepresented in the prison service. And dropping dead. There, a couple of months ago, we had 5 children that took their lives from the age of 9 to the age of 13.
Oh my God!
We're trying to raise these issues for a very long time. It's not because we're blaming them. We know. I'm convinced because this has been going on so long, and people got re-educated from 1922 back into the old English way. Because if you didn't change Trinity College or Maynooth College or the King's Inn, well, therefore your children were going to grow up thinking this was their reality.
Right.
Come a couple of decades afterwards, you could not recognize travelers. They said we were gypsies. They said we were Roma.
Right.
Failed settled people that were dropouts from society. All the things that the bombarded travelers with. So we were segregated in all the systems. And this is why there's a lot of psychological issues around identity and stuff like this. Because we're told one day we're one thing, and we're told another day there were something else.
Yeah. I suppose that one of my great grandfathers, Charlie Collins, would have been one of them.
What was his surname?
Collins.
Collins.
Yeah.
Oh my! We could be related.
You look a little bit like him. That's funny. And my other great grandfather on my mother's side was Scottish, so
we could be related there also.
Oh, he's a McDonald's. So his branch of the family went to Cuba. And my grandmother's, my grandmother's branch was in Louisiana. So Collins was in Louisiana, and McDonald was in Cuba.
Wow.
So we could be cousins for all we know.
I believe so because there's quite a large Collins traveler family in Ireland.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
And then there's the settled Collins. But again, this is just nothing about separate people. It's just about how to grow up. Like take the working class, the middle class, and the elites. I always seen that as like a segregated education system.
Right.
And that was the only thing that ever divided people in the first place. So if you've got the public schools for the masses, then you got the universities for the middle classes, and then
Mm-hmm.
the elites actually ran the whole system anyways.
Right.
So that
Right.
system
Yeah, that's right.
That system ran for centuries. That's why
Right.
you have this kind of psychological divides between these people. And this is why another thing we're skipping back again about to fascism, racism, and
Mm-hmm.
I come from a community that has been excluded. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not seen as intelligent unless you have an education.
Right.
The people with the education believe themselves also to be intelligent.
Right.
And this was rubbing people up the wrong way constantly.
Right.
Which you find in America also. Because all these people are human beings. They're just hurt people.
Right.
They're not actually fascist. They're not even racist.
No.
Some of them are too stupid to know the difference. And some of them are too hurt to even care.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, it's really true.
I think if you come along with a bit of an education, a bit of a strategy, you can take advantage of a lot of people like that because you'll feed into their fears and feed into their anxieties. Because the NGOs and even what we call the left here, they're always trying to tell us, and it's not their fault because, again, they're lovely people. But Alan Watts would say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So they were telling us it's the state. The state is racist and so on and so forth. We're thinking, yeah, it's a bit more complex than that. It's not about race. Because when you compare what has happened to Irish people and Irish travelers today, it's almost identical in many ways that happened in other colonies with other people.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I would recognize that people of color, would say, people who are not white, not from the Western world, I believe they did get it more psychologically worse, at least, because they weren't prepared for it. At least in Ireland, we were clan-based people.
Right, yeah.
People our shows, they had the same complexion, and we're more times than often, history would tell us we used to beat the shit out of them. We just got unlucky on one time.
Yeah, really unlucky that one time.
Yeah, but maybe your thoughts on that, because I know we're kind of. I mean, for me, I'll scatter from right here to the 1600s and back again, and I confuse people, I imagine.
Well, I'd like to do that too, actually. But first, though, I have a question for you guys. What do you think about travelers having been declared an ethnic group? Right. I mean, I understand the administrative benefits that can come with it, right? I also understand the less pleasant consequences, right, that can come from it. And I'm just curious how you think about it.
Yeah, it comes down to, I suppose, identity, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I would say, because when you learn it, we get a bit older, you learn a bit more. Again, I mentioned that all human beings are 99.9% genetically related around the world.
Right, that's right.
So all we could ever talk about is identity and culture.
Right. Yeah, which is funny as hell. I mean, just to make a plug, that there is more genetic variation between two groups of chimpanzees that live on different sides of the same river than there is among the entire population of Homo sapiens. So yeah, like we're all basically the same thing.
That's it. And I suppose our brain is programmed. I like to borrow a bit of a guy, Professor Robert Solpolsky, who I emailed a couple of times. I tried to approach the very professional biologist approach.
Oh, yeah.
I told him, come back to Ireland, everybody's colonized, and he'll be famous once he unravels. But that didn't work so well. So he was also a zoologist.
Oh, okay.
And I tried the zoologist part. I said there was a guy in Ireland once upon a time, his name was Charles Kingsley, and he had referred to Irish people as white chimpanzees.
Oh, yeah, right.
I said, you work with chimpanzees. You think there might be something into it? Do you think we should talk? But he's very busy at the moment writing a book, but I will get him on sometime. I'll just finish off slightly and get over to Dylan, because I know you asked a question. I know I'll wander, and then I'll rant and I'll talk, and I won't when to stop.
I'm the same way, brother.
The part for us was we would have been okay with everything if everything had been okay with us. In other words, if we were segregated, excluded, degraded, othered, well, then we wouldn't have known the difference either. We too would have grown up in a natural environment.
Right.
For centuries, and this is recorded. My parents went through it. Their grandparents went through it. Their grandparents went through it. My children are going through it, and I'm sure my grandchildren will go through it. So in parallel, there was this other mentality, and we call it the colonial mentality. That had other thoughts regardless. So if we didn't care about identity or culture or anything else, they kept reminding us who we were.
Right. Definitely it does. Yeah.
Yeah. All I was going to say was that that was one of the reasons that we ended up working together, is exactly to that question you were saying about ethnic status. There was that campaign was happening a few years ago, just before the. And by the way, the Taoiseach, he announced it, but he also was really careful to say that there's no laws, no legislation being enacted. It's a symbolic thing, but
right.
And the wider society, and will create no new individual, no new constitutional, or no new financial rights.
But at the same time, I was in contact with Bernard at the time, because we were I was wondering myself. I was kind of thinking, this is strange and exactly why the likes of me, looking at the longer past, I was kind of intrigued, because I was thinking, this, in the absence of a proper history, this is a very strange decision to make.
Right. Yeah.
Because what you're doing is declaring you're declaring what was the majority culture in the country a few centuries ago. You're now declaring these people to be an ethnic minority in their own country.
Right. Yeah.
And as you said, that could have. I mean, I didn't know. It's up to Bernard and obviously the community to decide what's best. But the thing was that it was the Bernard's great, the ones that you have the conflict with all the time, the government-sponsored NGOs, as we call them, that were really pushing this, and this was a great thing, but it was being pushed in the absence of any narrative that really made any sense. The idea was that travelers had no history and were similar to Roma, who had come in from outside,
right,
or gypsies, like European gypsies.
Right. Yeah.
We know they came from outside, so they didn't have roots in the country. But this would still, they were given ethnic status, which, yes, would have some benefits. But on the other hand, it would copper fasten the idea that they did not have any, there was no claims to address, no injustice coming from the past or by the state.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly what I was wondering. Right. I mean, and it's funny, man, like I have actually read people, scholars supposedly, who have tried to argue that travelers are in fact Roma, and I thought, come on, how fucking ridiculous can that be, right? I mean, but just make it up, right?
Yeah, well, it was been the state policy, wasn't it? Since 1963, at least, it was seems to have been a state.
I suspect what happened was that the state became embarrassed. It's like colonial shame, I'll call it. Because if you had to identify these people in a cultural norm, that means who are we kind of thing. And if we already told the world that we're the Irish, and now there's two different cultures, that makes things complex.
Right.
It was actually Enda Kenny that was in Dawn. He was saying there'll be no financial benefits and there'll be no constitutional changes. And then he was careful, and I've seen this several times, to say a people within a people. So he was sending out the message that these are a degenerated group that broke away from us, and we're not letting them recognize them as a culture.
Right.
And then there was a documentary a while back, which actually was life-saving for me, because I grew up with this stuff, even without an education, which is absolutely traumatizing in itself.
Right.
Because you're locked within your mind without a formal education. But I already had experienced this, and I got bits and pieces growing up. Malcolm X, Angela Davis, even if it was on the TV, I could recognize actually what's happening to you seems to be also happening to us.
Right.
But I could never make the sense of it because I was too young at the time.
Right.
I grew up sensing this anyway with it, but they were always careful to word the narrative. So in other words, a people within a people would dissolve any kind of indigenous culture on the island. As other words, the settled people are the indigenous culture, we're other. So a documentary came up on the geneticists, and the geneticists were saying that there was a divergence 360 years ago, which is perfectly fine, because that's when, Dylan will tell you, that's when the Elizabethan conquest kicked off. And with that, they brought in what they called penal laws, making people ashamed of their language, their traditions, their customs, and so on and so forth. Then there was another one called the martial law. And martial law could go from 1 year to 60 years. And that was specifically designed to kill the Gaels. I mean, historians recognize this. It was like open shooting season. And this is why you have some travelers where genetic markers become isolated, because people were taken for the hills and the bogs and the woods. Anywhere they could survive. Because 60 years is what? A couple of generations.
Right.
But even in that, they were saying that the travelers diverged from the settled population. And
so they're racializing the travelers, basically.
Yeah, but absolutely. But in a way that it wasn't realistic and it wasn't strange, because we're trying to say we're ethnic minority, but in my head, I would say visualize, say, someone like Mark Charles. he would be indigenous to America because he came from the indigenous tribes.
Oh, yeah, right.
He's an indigenous person.
Right.
Now, and if you say, I'll just use an example, say African Americans taken from their land, they brought to America, they were recognized as people without their land.
Right.
So to say the travelers were ethnic was the same as saying they were Roma, that we came off the land.
Right, that's right.
This was the state narrative, to do everything they possibly could to make it look like the travelers were something else and we were the normal people.
Right.
But that's where they got a lot of their EU funding from, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I thought you mentioned that right at the beginning, which makes sense too. Yeah, thanks. I'm learning a lot.
I hope we're having your brain melted over it.
Oh, no, this is fabulous, right? Because I'm really interested in this, right? So for a variety of reasons. One of them, which something you just said kind of sparked in my head. As a young activist in my 20s, and I admit also as a Catholic, I was very much invested in the struggles in the North, and actually met Bernadette Devlin once, like in the U.S. When I was in my early 20s. So I saw that as part of my struggle. In the same way,
Bernadette Devlin comes from the traveler background.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, and then in the same way, I saw the Palestinian struggle as part of my struggle, and the parallels between the Irish and the Palestinians, but especially on the archaeological front, are so striking. But another thing that people don't talk about much, and I'll send you this article when we get off. But there's a guy named Leonard Liggio who wrote an article in the mid-1970s called "The English Origins of American Racism," and it was an argument that the British developed and advanced race theory in their conquest of Ireland, and then they exported it from Ireland to the New World, and then later to Australia and stuff. So yeah, I mean those links are all there, man. It's all so I'm completely fascinated by learning all this.
Yeah, so we could see that the way that, and Dylan take this one over again. It's a kind of because when you went to the Gaelic society, we didn't have the same laws. We had Brehon law, and English law then was from common law, which came from Roman law, which came from Moses law and Hammurabi law, and so on and so forth. So that one way, that was over that direction. It all came to Ireland. Ireland for a very long time was already a distinct ethnic group from the rest of Europe. In other words, they had kind of a Gaelic mentality. They had more of a feudal system. So even say the laws that were happening in Ireland from the 1600s onwards, and the surrender and grant, Irish people, their children will grow up in an English environment. They didn't grow up with English law, and that would be their reality. So it was kind of it was shipped out into America, and it was shipped out to other places. Go ahead.
There was this and very interesting. When I went to a university in Galway, it was very interesting. I think Canny, as Bernard would be familiar with him, historian called Canny. But there was him and a few others in this sort of school of history there that used to take it for granted that the frontier, the idea of the frontier, that for many centuries the Pale around Dublin, and for centuries that was the line of the conquest. That was the line of, you could call it feudal Europe. The English city, the cities. Sorry, Dublin was there, and then the Pale was that narrow boundary around it, and beyond that was what Bernard describes, the wild Irish. Many centuries until the 17th century, that was the extent of the English possessions in Ireland.
To
the point where, as they often say, that beyond the Pale, meaning really out there, basically comes from that. What was I trying to say there? Yeah, there was a school, that's what I was going to say. They used to teach us the same thing, that in the 1600s, when they started to expand across Ireland, and this is one of the things that Bernard's describing, as each step we take back in history, every century back to the 1600s, travelers are less and less. They become the majority eventually. What we would call travelers now eventually just becomes what Irish culture is. And the actual the sort of capitalist Europe, or the feudal capitalist Europe that we would know, only was within the Pale.
And
so when they begin the expansion, they expand westward. and they start building forts and stuff. And it was a school of thought that actually they at about 1603 and 1607, when they defeated us at Kinsale, the way was open, the sea route was open, and off they went into the Virginia.
Ah, okay, yeah.
And actually, you can trace a lot of the same the idea of the Wild West, the idea of the frontier, the idea of civilization,
right,
being behind the pale would be something that would match very closely with what you said about that scholar in the 70s talking about. Also, the idea of the Irish were the original ones that they applied all of these kind of laws to, about like they're inferior and started to construct this whole kind of colonial concept of like we're in charge because we're naturally superior and inferior. And it was interesting because it was actually at this point where there wasn't any different color, so it had to be based on other colors.
Well, yeah, and frankly, I mean, there's been a lot of work on this too. That color didn't even become a way that people most frequently or most conspicuously saw difference. That in itself was a product of the expansion of the imperialist enterprise. To Africa, Asia, and Latin America, right? But before that, I mean, people didn't even recognize color, right? Height, right? Clothing. So it makes perfect sense, right? And I mean, and I recall, like in the 19th century here, and I guess in England too, what would be called ethnologists, or even anthropologists, or race theorists, really imagine that they could see significant physiological and morphological differences between Irish people and English people. And even for that matter, in the Victorian era, English biologists were convinced that the English working class was racially different from the aristocracy, right? But even as you fast forward right toward the present, who can tell the difference between a Serb and a Croat, right? Except that one crosses like this and the other crosses like that. But that's the only fucking difference. But they imagine that they can perceive deep differences. And the Tutsis and the Hutu, right? It's the same thing, right? Right. It's the conflict that gives people the sense that there are fundamental differences. And it's kind of a matter of choosing up sides and being able to defend the side that you choose without having to make an argument, right? It's like, we're fundamentally different from them, right? I mean, therefore we're antagonists. And all this crap about, primordial hatreds and shit, it's all bullshit that's constructed right in the present, right? The Middle East too, I mean. But anyway, I'm going off on a rant.
No, you're not. Keep talking.
That's very important because it's true. They were, and I like what you'd said about the scholar in the 70s. That's exactly how we'd see it. A lot of that story does, from our point of view, or that story does begin in Ireland. And sometimes when we see the history it goes into the West Indies, and we see it in Jamaica,
right,
Barbados particularly, where they were.
Yep.
And then the Irish are transported to the islands, and it's all chaotic. But
well, and my son, who's a real historian, right, often has this complaint or this discussion with students. He says, "Look, slavery was horrible, right? Totally, right? And there's nothing quite like it. But indentured servitude is pretty fucked up too. And the idea of being shipped to here or Barbados or, God forbid, Australia." Right, where from the moment you get off the boat, every living being on the island is trying to fucking kill you, right? With 27 of the most venomous snakes in the world and all the rest of that stuff, was nobody's idea of a good time, right? And people are fucked over, but fucked over in different ways, like with different adjectives and adverbs and like different status. But the key point is they were all fundamentally fucked over in the same way by the same people for the same reasons.
I would see that very much like that also, because again, when I tell my story, it's based on colonization. So we're aware that colonization went global. So
right.
Therefore, my experiences are everybody else's experiences.
Right.
And
That's
if we can get on a kind of a sideline and say, look, your experiences, my experiences, rather than putting visions between them, if we could project them in front of us. And that's where we'll come back to Ireland again. There was a Gaelic culture. There are people at this present moment talking that come from a Gaelic identity and culture. And we culture is real. That had been manufactured in Ireland. It went around the world. And if you take a step back and look at the Western world, because the English language itself is made up of other European languages.
Right.
And it was a very trade-based language. It was a systematic for bartering and so on and so forth. And if you look at America and other Western countries, they're very business-like orientated people.
Right.
They run their countries like companies. But if you take a step back and you see Canada, Australia, America, New Zealand, it's almost simultaneously identical to what's happening to these ethnic minorities, these indigenous people. The outcomes are almost identical. High rates of suicide, unemployment, attitudes. So for me, it's kind of like, if we brought it all back to Ireland, and not to make us any bit special. Now, if you want to go for a special in Ireland, you have to go to Sligo. That's where the only bit of special left in the world when it comes to Gaelic culture.
We're beyond the pale.
We're so far beyond the pale. It's unbelievable. But it's a point, because I would never want to take away from anyone else's experience.
Yeah, right,
when someone says to me that I'm a victim of racism because I'm black or because I'm from China or whatever it might be, and we're saying we too fit that description.
Yeah.
And they say, well, no, you can't because you're white. Yeah. And then we're saying, well, this what caused all the issues in the first place. People telling people what they couldn't be and wouldn't be.
Right, right.
But if we could take our experiences and say, look, they're human experiences. They're external to us. We cannot blame each other up to this point, because this is an ongoing colonial system. And I'm using Ireland as a prime example. If they taught nobody on the island that they were still using English systems, they never taught the children in the school that were still using English systems, and never taught the children to ever question the state.
Right.
Because by default, they are the normal people. They are the state.
Right.
The
That's
only
right.
people you should research and look at is those on the fringes and others.
Right.
So in Ireland, they were researching the travellers. I mean, for the last 100+ years, they've been researching the travellers. So one day I said, more or less, would you ever fuck off and research yourselves? Where did you get your language? And where did you get your systems? And where did you get your institutions? When you figure that part out, come back and ask us who we are then. This is the conflict we're having here.
Yeah. Well, no. Yeah, that's very good. I mean, so just to underscore a point you made a couple of minutes ago, I have a good friend who's a former grad advisor of mine, whose own family is originally from Dominica in the West Indies, but he works in public health, and he's got an ongoing project now comparing class and race and public health outcomes in the US and in New Zealand. And just as you were saying about travelers, like all the fucked up indicators that you would expect to find, or that you find in the US and also you find in Ireland, you find among the Maori. Right. And stuff like, obesity, smoking, right? Heart attacks, right? Hypertension. Yeah, right. Exactly. And certainly that's true with the indigenous population in Canada, right? And in the US. Yeah. So it's all a function of being on the bottom. So, one of the reasons that I developed a reputation about being something like an academic bomb thrower in the 80s and the 90s was the idea of an urban underclass had sort of taken shape. Well, I wrote an article about this, I'll send you too, but it had taken shape as a way to try to explain inequality. And it had taken shape just as much among liberals as among conservatives. And what it does, or did, like in my view, it still does, is basically create a new racial category, right? So if you think about it like this, by the 1990s, explicit embrace of racial bigotry as normally understood, right, among any of the 3 to 5 major racial food groups was negatively sanctioned in American society, right? I mean, nobody, even racists, wanted to admit to being a racist, right?
That's right.
But the beauty of the underclass idea is that the way that the underclass notion was constructed was that, it's the busted people at the bottom, of course, but the narratives to explain why they got there or how they're culturally fucked up and backward, very much like we described about travelers. But the beauty of it was that while the general underclass population was disproportionately Black and Hispanic, it wasn't so completely Black and Hispanic that it could be reduced to being a slur on Blacks or Hispanics. So it's almost like a new racial construct that does the work of a racial ideology without the stigma that attaches to embracing a racial ideology, if that makes sense, right? Right. I mean, like in the sense that we're also so accustomed now, and like I understand this is, this is even true in Ireland, to get with the hair on the back up if somebody says something hostile about Blacks, right, or about in the U.S. about Hispanics, right? But if you can say you could say whatever you want to say about the so-called underclass, because it wasn't just Black or Hispanic, and I started calling it out for what it was when people did that, and then people thought I was intemperate and an academic bomb thrower. But fuck it. Like if you're gonna bust on the people on the bottom, then like prepare. Well, so there's a game that's not played much anymore, but in an urban Black America of an earlier generation, there's a performance called The Dozens, and what The Dozens was like guys out on a street corner or in a pub or something, trading insults to one another, but the insults were about the other person's mother, right? So it's like your mom is so fat she could swim in SeaWorld or whatever. And what I've often said, and this I said about the underclass people too, that okay, if you want to play the dozens on poor people, go ahead. But before you start playing the dozens, you need to check and see what your own mother's doing at home, because I'm going to fucking call it out. But I mentioned that shaggy dog tail because this is like another version of how the racialization process works. And it's not tied to phenotype. It's not tied to the, Africa, Asia, Latin America, right, or Europe. And in fact, like in the history of race theory, at its high point, around the turn of the 20th century, the sort of race scientists had deduced that there were 36 different races in Europe. So how the fuck could that be, right? But in fact, I mean, that was one of the things that basically killed race theory or race science, because the harder the race scientists tried to find the definitive differences, right, the boundaries that set off one racial group from another, the more they came up against the fact that you, Bernard, pointed out that 99.9% of us is all the same, so that the idea is a fiction. And the harder they tried to prove it, the more they failed. And then eventually, I mean, that helped to go away among some other things. But yeah, anyway, I mean, this is, no, I take your point about the colonial, the mentality, and especially from an Irish point of view, I see that's a powerful metaphor, right? Because it does work the same way, right? It works the same way all over the world. And if you guys, as well as for your viewers, if you're interested, Tariq Ali just published a really great book on Churchill. And like I spent my entire life detesting Winston Churchill. And I couldn't wait for this book to come out, right? Because I knew that Tariq would really drive the knife all the way into him. And he did an autopsy. And it's fabulous because the book is also a really broad account of colonialism spread across the world, and he's got a couple of nice chapters on Churchill and Ireland, right? Also, but I mean, here's the tease for the listeners. Like I didn't realize, like I said to Tariq, that I knew he was a worthless son of a bitch, but I didn't realize how many of the horrible events of the period between the 1880s and when Satan called them home had his fingerprints on them. But an even more delightful little factoid is that his mother, who was
not Irish, hopefully.
Huh?
Not Irish, I hope.
No, better, right, much better. She was an American heiress, and she, how should I put this? So Churchill was a kind of loser as a kid, and his mother bestowed her charms and favors onto powerful men to help him get through school and get the naval appointments that
It was
that
the
he
same with
wanted.
Forrest Gump, wasn't it?
Oh, well, I'll tell you what. Well, yeah, probably. I never saw the Forrest Gump movie because it just felt.
His mother had to pay for his medical stuff and his education, so she had to favor herself towards.
Oh, well, she paid through her underwear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yes, that was Churchill.
Does it not remind you a bit of Boris Johnson? Boris Johnson of.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah.
It's uncanny. It's like his.
Right.
He actually goes out of his way to act like him too, which he shouldn't because he fits pretty perfect as it is.
Right. Totally, really does.
Churchill was not popular here, as you can imagine. I'm sure those
right.
chapters go into that all right, because he was responsible for the black and tans in Ireland.
Oh yeah, that's right. Right, that's right. Yeah, and he's a horrible bastard, right? And everything about him. Right, but the only good thing you can say about him is that he's dead.
Come here, was it your son that wrote that book? Was it your son, did you say?
No. There's a fellow named Tariq Ali, who's a Pakistani Englishman.
Oh wow, yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, so I mean, he's got he has his own colonial reasons for hating Churchill.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we would share a lot of similarities.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, you asked earlier on, maybe, or maybe you didn't, or maybe I was wishing you would ask, how we might sort of change this, how we might turn.
Oh yeah, right.
Because I grew up unemployed, and I grew up angry, and I grew up vexed, and I became actually bitter after a while because Malcolm X got me into trouble about 20 odd years ago. when I thought by going into the NGOs and saying our 9-to-5 oppressors, our friends, they must change their roles, because if we fall in the settle lead, well, then we'll end up as settle people.
Right.
I was always wanting to give us the infrastructure and the support, and let us create our own democracy, our own system that's not separate, but in the same environment of goodwill, does no harm to the environment and does no harm to us and does no harm to anybody else. And then it's because the English language is so coded and it's so kind of restrictive and it's very plain, is that a lot of the people were adapting all the programs from the state. So when they created a traveller support group, it was actually designed in the same program that had colonized Ireland in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
But 50 years later, with all the supports, all the investment, millions of euros, because we don't have the worst government in the world, and we don't have the worst EU either, for that matter.
Right.
Flaws and faults, but I wouldn't want to burn it down. I wouldn't want to crash it.
Right.
They always believe there's something we can add to it, we can fine tune it.
Right.
If they don't do that, what we're seeing in America and what we're seeing around the rest of the world is that hurt and anger is coming home to
No, that's right. No, that's
by these political parties.
Right. No, that's right. I think that's the most important fact of life in global politics today. It's all over the world. Yeah, I agree with you. And that's what we have to find ways to address.
So if we say with the NGOs and the country, and again, it's not a criticism, because it's very difficult, because on one hand, you can take Steven Pinker's version of the world is getting better, less crime. I like that version. I do like it. It sounds nice.
Oh, yeah, it would.
But it's almost like in a three-tier system again. I mean, on one tier, one particular mentality, that may be the reality. That's what that person sees.
Right.
But on another tier of it, it looks like despite all the good things happening, there's really bad outcomes also coming.
Right.
So
no, that's right.
The goodwill of the NGOs and the support groups, they're like getting them the campaign and the lobby and the fight. But yes, statistically, in 50 years, it has shown psychologically these people are getting worse and worse.
Right.
Therefore, there's something not quite right with that system. So we believe it's to do with the mentalities and the psychology, because we're not trying to separate ourselves as to qualify as victims of racism.
Right.
We're not playing the victims either, because we're telling people that because your systems is lovely, but it's not, we didn't come from there. But if we could create our own system, and that's why I set up the Vision Foundation, is trying to create a social enterprise, and it's particularly around decolonization. I believe the whole decolonization doesn't start anywhere other than in your own mind first. One, we have to understand that the three of us are using a language that would not have been originally ours. So now we're using the thought, we're going by its logic and its definitions. But I'd like to give you an example for this. Again, in Ireland, all the things that are happening to travelers now happen to Irish people at the hands of the English. The English have come up with the term itinerants. They were also calling us noble savages. I rather that one than the itinerant one. They called us itinerants, and then they called us thinkers, and then Irish travelers were born out of that again. So why would Irish people inside an English institution, using English systems, using the same language and terminology against Irish travelers where the English against their ancestors?
Yeah, no, I hear you. So it's a little bit off track, I'm sorry, but I thought I would offer like another case of the same phenomenon you're talking about, that maybe some people in the audience may keep in mind, because these things pop up and they go away. But like, if you remember the so-called crisis in Darfur, right, from a decade or so ago. Well, it turns out, and like, this was another friend and former colleague of mine, a guy named Mahmoud Mamdani, who's a political scientist, did a great book on the Darfur crisis that was called Saviors and Survivors. Turns out there never has been any such place as Darfur, right? I mean, this was a made-up term for a section of Western Sudan that the U.S. State Department and the Israelis principally, and the NGO world came up with. There never was a genocide. But most of all, like, there never was any real distinction in that part of Sudan between something called Arabs and something called Africans. And what you know from a pastoralist life is that, you know, there were like, at one latitude, right, there were like cattle pastoralists, and at another there were sheep pastoralists, and at another there were settled farmers. And when climate change, largely or most consequentially, the advance of the Sahel, sort of pushed the cattle pastoralist herders down into the territory of the sheep herders, pushed the sheep herders down into the territory of the settled farmers, that's when you had conflicts. But the conflicts didn't have anything to do with race. And then moreover, it was customary, and I'm sure like this is the case within traveler clans too, that people would marry or move from one clan to another and be absorbed by the new clan, and that the identities weren't all that sharp. It all meant something quite different and much more fluid, until, as we can all say, with different degrees of inflection, the fucking British showed up.
Yeah, because it's one of the specialities, of course, is what you had said, and is that, and what Bernard's described to me many times as well, which is that all of these terms, as you would say, Bernard, are labels, and they brilliant at coming up with labels and using names to make to either other people or these guys are different for this reason, or
that's right,
they're definitely a different race, or they're your enemy.
Yeah, well, and you got to give them credit for a demonic skill, because that little piss pot island ran most of the world for most of modern history.
Right? They were very clever at it. And it was a little bit earlier, it reminded me of a quote. I was going to say that if anyone believes that it was really about, even in Ireland, that the wars and all the rest were about race or even identity or any of that kind of thing. There were many things involved, but at the end of the day, I remember coming up, but none of the English would make out, they're fighting because they're savages, or they hate civilization and all that kind of stuff. I remember that I'd come across a quote from 1519 in Ireland. I think the papal nuncio reported he talked to some Irish guys at the time, and they said to him that he was representing the English. The Irish had said to him that they say we're brutal, as in the English,
Oh, yeah.
brutal because we make private property of the gifts of nature.
Yeah.
And that they make sense because the Irish they said we believe that all things should be held in common.
Right, that's right. And they've imposed that all over the world.
Yeah,
yeah. That's
and
right.
when I seen that that's in a letter from 1519.
Wow. Yeah.
When I saw that, I thought, oh look, we've been. Why are we sifting through this stuff? You know,
it's
right?
Interesting
Yeah.
because in 1963 there was a commission report into itinerance by the state, and this was like a real soft version of forced assimilation, but it was 15 years after World War II, so you had to be a little careful. But it didn't stop them using the language like there can be no final solution till these people are absorbed into the general population.
Wow.
And then that's where all the segregation and the othering had come in. Coming on, Mr. Reed, we really appreciated your time and your knowledge, and we hope to do
it's my pleasure. I'd love to do it anytime you want. So just let me know.
We'll let you finish off with the last few words before we pull down the curtains for tonight. So over to you, Mr. Reed.
Well, I don't have much more to say except that I've always felt empathy with the struggle of the Irish, and I've felt it more the more I've paid close attention, and I feel it even more now. And I count you brothers as my comrades, and I look forward to being in touch again, and maybe have a pint together at some point.
Absolutely, Mr. Reed. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll most certainly talk again. I've no doubt about that. I might try to get your son on next because good. Okay. He did say he was a real historian, so we're looking for real historians.
Well, I'll send you his contact info.
Absolutely, Mr. Reed. Thank you, and God bless, and take care of yourself.
Oh yeah, you too. Take care.